Okay, this is Phil Decker, and this is a discussion of structure and how it relates to other dimensions, and this tape is for the leadership class. The goals of this presentation are basically for you to understand organizational structure, but more importantly to understand the fit between structure and other things like technology and people, and culture and strategy. So the bottom line is, if those things don't fit, the organization is not usually successful. Now the simple way of thinking is that I'm going to structure based on strategy and so forth, and I'm going to choose people based on strategy, but it rarely ever works that way. Usually an organization is built up and built up and built up and gets this huge complex structure, and then it wants to change its strategy, or a technology comes along and changes, which therefore forces other parts of the structure and the environment and everything to move. So it's a multi-dimensional interconnection, and it's not one thing leads to the next. It's not strategy leads to structure, which leads to people. That only happens when you first start an organization. After that, they all interact equally, and you have to pay attention to all of them as an executive, because if you don't, your organization will be extremely ineffective and possibly fail. So we're going to talk about a number of things. And oh, by the way, there are a set of slides that I hope you got before we started this lecture, because I'm not going to be showing the slides. They're on paper, and you should be looking at them. Just the first slide basically talks about the contextual and structural dimensions of an organization. And contextual things are size and technology and environment and professionalism. They're the non-structure things. And structural are formalization and complexity and span of control and etc. All of those things, if you don't know what they are, look them up. You should have taken a management course. Span of control is how many people an individual manager has under their control that they're responsible for. Centralization versus differentialization is how decisions are made in an organization. They all are very meaningful concepts, but we are going to talk about the connection between the contextual and the structural items in how organizations are put together and how they're changed. Now, there's also a slide about the stages of development during an organizational life cycle. I'm not going to talk about organizational life cycle here, but it is an important concept. Organizations usually start much simpler than they get to as they age. But there is a slide that talks about the birth of an organization and a young organization in the middle stage and so forth. And it talks about whether it's bureaucratic and how the structure is and what the management style is. Obviously, when an organization first starts, it tends to be very non-bureaucratic. It tends to be entrepreneurial. The problems in that organization getting to the next step are usually a crisis of leadership. One of the reasons that small businesses fail, there's 2 or 3 big reasons why small businesses fail, like they're undercapitalized. But one of the biggest ones is that the founder can't let go. The founder can't hire an HR officer and a finance director and so forth and so forth. They have to continue to be entrepreneurial and own everything. And as an organization increases in size, you need to differentiate and break up those functions, particularly boundary spanning roles, which we're going to talk about. So let's start with one of the major elements. The elements, there's a slide that talks about all the elements, but they are environment, strategy, structure, people, technology, and I'm probably missing one. But those are the elements we're going to talk about. I'll talk about each one of them in order and then talk about how they fit. The most complex is structure, because there are a number of different kinds of structures in organizations. The first one is environment, and there's a slide that breaks environment down from the task environment, and the general environment. The organization sits in the middle, and it's surrounded immediately by the task environment, and then ultimately by the overall environment. The task environment includes competitors, customers, suppliers, and your workforce. Those are the people that you directly interact with every day. And then the outer environment is the economy and the government that passes laws, and financial resources, the cost of money in the economy, natural resources, of course, and basic technology, the culture of society. Those are all in that overall general environment. They all affect the organization, but they affect it through competitors, suppliers, workforce, and customers. The ultimate issue about environment for an organization or for a leader in an organization is the uncertainty of an environment. What any organization or any group of leaders in any organization are doing is they're trying to create a certain environment for the organization. Uncertainty kills you. Certainty is what you want in an organization. We could go into organizational theory and talk about social systems theory. In social systems theory, holding a steady state is what you want, and that steady state is certainty of your environment. And there's a slide that talks about the different characteristics of uncertainty, whether you have low uncertainty or moderately low, and so forth. And when your environment is complex and very unstable, that's where you get the highest uncertainty. Where your environment is stable and fairly simple, that's where you're going to get low uncertainty, or the most certain. And so it's nice to discuss different kinds of uncertainty, and of course we face different kinds of uncertainty. You guys are in healthcare, and the bottom line is you're always going to be facing high uncertainty. At least in your career you are. I mean, you have a very complex environment. It's not going to get any easier. There's always going to be a political side to it. There's probably also always going to be it's always going to be a for-profit system. I think in my lifetime it will be. And on the other side, it's a very unstable system. There's not enough money to pay for it. There's more money, more people coming into it. There's a lot of things that are keeping that environment unstable. So just assume right off the bat, you and your career are going to face high uncertainty in any organizational environment that you face in a healthcare provider organization. So the issue is, what do I do about that uncertainty? And there are basically two things that an organization can do to handle uncertainty. They can either predict the environment or they can control it, one or the other. Prediction comes down to it comes down to a number of things. It comes down to planning and forecasting. There are lots of things that go on in an organization where you are planning for the future. You're going out and scanning the environment, and you're creating plans to deal with the uncertainty that you would face. Your HR officers are going to scan the different schools that are around you and how many nurses they're going to turn out and where those nurses tend to go and what kind of salaries they demand. And so that's an HR function that is going out and scanning the environment and forecasting it and planning based on that forecast. So that's one of the basic things that you can do to predict the environment. You go out, you scan it, and you forecast it, and you plan for that forecast. Every part of your organization has a section that does that. HR does, finance does, marketing, on and on and on. And those roles are called boundary spanning roles. It's not a critical name, but But those are the people that sit on the boundary of your organization and they look out and they deal with the outside in the environment. They're out there collecting information or dealing with people in the environment. And so HR's got people inside that are calculating pay and benefits and getting people paid and getting checks in their accounts and doing, that's all internal stuff. But they also have people that are forecasting the supply of labor and the cost of labor. Those are boundary spanning roles. So an organization that does a lot of effort on predicting the environment is going to have more boundary spanning roles. And so those aren't bad roles. They cost money. They are overhead like everything else from management on. But if you have a more unstable environment, you're going to have more boundary spanning roles and you're going to spend more money on predicting the environment. The other is control strategies. There are many more control strategies than there are planning and forecasting strategies. Control strategies include contractual arrangements, acquisitions, co-optation, advertising. All illegal activities are control strategies. Contractual arrangements is that you contract for something and you even out the price of it. For years and years and years, Southwest Airlines had a competitive advantage against the other airlines because they had contracted the price of fuel for years and years and years in advance. And only in the last few years did that strategic advantage collapse because their contracts ran out. And now they're buying fuel on the market just like everybody else. So the prices have gone up. But that contractual arrangement gave them a predictable, even supply of fuel and a predictable cost of fuel. Co-optation is basically absorbing parts of your environment, going out and buying one of your competitors or buying a supplier to make sure that supply and competition are predictable, certain. Advertising will do that also, public relations. You've taken a marketing course. You know that there's basically two strategies in marketing. One is a pull strategy and one is a push strategy. You either push yourself onto the buyer or you pull the buyer to you. Advertising is a pull. What's an example? You cannot go to a baseball stadium in America, very few of them, and not have Anheuser-Busch beer. Why? Because Anheuser-Busch is contracted with all the baseball stadiums, and Anheuser-Busch products are the only products sold in the stadium. So guess what? When you go to that stadium, what are you going to drink? Anheuser-Busch beer. And so that's a control strategy. That's a marketing strategy, essentially. You could call it a contractual arrangement also, but illegal activities, almost anything that's illegal is something after the fact that was done to try to control a situation that's out of hand. It's just like getting a penalty in sports. Who gets the penalty in sports? The guy who did it the second. The first guy doesn't get the penalty. Somebody smacks you in the face, and then what do? You retaliate. The referee sees you retaliating, and you get the penalty. So almost all illegal activity is a control strategy that either works or doesn't work, but it's illegal. But anyway, you could go on and on and on. There are lots, trade associations, mergers. There's a lot of control strategies to control uncertainty of the environment. But what's important about the environment overall is that you do exist in an environment. It comes to you through your competitors and your suppliers and your workers. And you do things to make it less uncertain. You will do control or prediction strategies to reduce the uncertainty of that environment. Now, obviously, the issue here is how does that affect structure and people and technology and on and on. Well, if you have an uncertain environment, I've already said that you're going to have more boundary spanning roles in your organization. That's people and structure, if that makes sense. You're going to have more departments that are devoted to market research, personnel research, predicting the cost of labor. You're going to have all these departments that focus on collecting information out of the environment and forecasting from it. And that changes the structure of your organization. It makes it more diversified. It has more boundary spanning functions, etc. That is a structural change due to the uncertainty of the environment. So that's just one of the elements so far, environment. And what we really care about in the environment is the uncertainty. Now, let's talk about basic structure. There are essentially three kinds of structure that any organization can take on. They are functional, self-contained unit. We usually call that product line or service line structure. That's the typical term. But self-contained unit can be based on geography, not service line or product. And the second is hybrid structures. Most hospitals are hybrid structures. And I should have said four, because the way these slides are set up is that it's got functional, self-contained, hybrid, and matrix. The three that are really feasible are functional, self-contained, and matrix, which is both self-contained and functional at the same time. And then hybrid is tacked on stuff, but it becomes a fourth one. So let's talk about them. You have 4 slides, and it talks about when to use them, the strengths and the weaknesses for each. A functional structure is a structure that's based around function. Most hospitals traditionally have been functionally structured. They still are. Even when people say, oh, we're service-based, they're not. They're still really functionally structured. When you've got a function for nursing and a function for accounting and a function for budgeting and a function for HR, and you got biomed and you got engineering and you got technicians and pharmacy and you've got those divisions, that is an organization that's structured by function. All the pharmacists belong to the pharmacy department. All the nurses belong to the nursing department, and they all report up to the VP of nursing. That's a pure functional structure. You've got to start to get a hybrid structure when you've got one functionally structured hospital and you've bought another clinic or you've bought another hospital over here, and you've got a separate nursing department that reports up to, say, the COO, so reports up to the CEO of this structure and then over to the COO of the mothership. That becomes a hybrid structure, and it really becomes a mess. But a pure functional structure is everybody, all the nurses are together, and all the engineers and all the HR people are together. You can read the strengths and weaknesses. It's efficient. It is particularly useful when the importance of skills is high, because all of the training stays within function. And so, but the weakness is the coordination and decision making across the organization. Most decisions have to go to the top and then come down the other silo. So if there's a problem in nursing, it goes up and then it comes back down over here to the technicians. You don't have technicians and nurses within a team doing cross-functional decision making. And so it makes it inefficient. Now, what happens in most hospitals is they are functionally structured, but they try to operate in a self-contained unit form. And so they may put teams and committees together, or they may have a team here, a group of people that are responsible for orthopedic medicine or heart health or women's health. But the bottom line is the nurses still report to the VP of nursing, and the imagery people still report to imaging, and so forth and so forth. It looks like self-contained unit, but it's not. It's still a functional structure that's operating like a self-contained unit. The bottom line is, where's the budget money? If you put me in a team and the VP of management controls my salary, where's my loyalty? To the team or to the VP of management? VP of management is the person I'm going to look at. I might support this team a lot, but if it comes down to a conflict between the two, my loyalty's with the guy with the budget, bottom line. And so that's the problem in the hybrid structure where you take a functional organization and try to turn it into a self-contained unit without actually making a self-contained unit. Now, why would you use functional structure? Simply because it's efficient for small organizations, and remember, most healthcare organizations are small organizations. You're not talking about Shell or Chevron or somebody like that here. You're talking about Memorial Hermann with a very small footprint, only so many facilities, with small numbers of people in each facility. In-depth skill development is always important because we're dealing with highly skilled people. You're also dealing with licensing laws. Remember that nurses are licensed separate from physicians, separate from technicians, and so forth and so forth. Also remember that the physicians in most cases are outside the provider. They're a separate organization, but yet they control production. If you went to these guys in Shell and Chevron and said, I want to design an organization that's functionally structured, that it really needs to be very receptive to its customers, and oh, by the way, the people that control production don't work for the organization and we have no control over them, what do you think those guys would say? They would just die laughing. But that's what you guys are going to live with all the time. You are going to live with a functional structure that needs to operate as a self-contained unit structure, with operations decisions being made by a group of people who are not employed by the organization and do not have the same goals as the organization in most cases. In some cases they can't live without your organization, but a lot of them can live without your organization, and wherever you've got competition, they probably can live without you. So, talk about uncertainty of environment and responses from structure. You have a hard time here. Bottom line is, most organizations have moved to as far as they can get towards service line or self-contained unit structure because of the demands of the environment, but they can't move all the way because of the demands of the size of the organization and licensing laws. So it gets crazy. Now, before we go too much further, let's talk about self-contained unit structure. Self-contained unit structure is either built around geography or a product or a service line. It's built about something that's self-contained. Most truly self-contained unit organizations are built around a product or they're built around a geography. Self-contained unit structure was developed by Procter & Gamble back in the 1920s because they got to the point where they had too many diversified products. They had hand soap and they had dish soap and I don't know what all they had, but they had 7 or 8 significantly different products in the 1920s. Ivory soap was one of them. And what they did is they learned that the units were focusing on the customer more than they were focusing on the production. The production was relatively simple and straightforward. What became more powerful was the customer. Does that make sense? In functional structure, it's the operations that are more powerful. In self-contained unit structure, it is the customer that's more powerful. And that's why hospitals and healthcare in general in the last few years have moved to much more emphasis on self-contained unit because the customers have become so much powerful. It used to be that we went to the hospital and the hospital told us what to do. Now that's not true. The managed care companies have the upper hand, and with the internet and with co-payment, the customers, the patients are getting much more of the upper hand over the provider. And so because of the people getting the upper hand in this situation from the environment, the organization has had to structurally adapt. It's very hard for an organization that's small, functionally structured, and inhibited by regulations from every corner, licensing laws and Medicare and on and on and on. they haven't been able to totally change over to a self-contained unit structure. But hospitals have tried. They've tried to say, we've got women's services and orthopedic services and heart services, and that's a self-contained unit. But they're really not structured that way. They operate that way. Those are two different things. But you can see the movement of structure because of environment and patients and so forth. Self-contained unit structure it's fast, decision-making's easy because it's in the self-contained unit. In that self-contained unit, which you just call it orthopedic, in that self-contained unit is all the nurses and all the imaging and all the docs and all the technicians and all the lab and pharmacy and so forth. They only deal with orthopedic patients. Now that's never the case, but if that was magically to happen, that would be a self-contained unit structure. But we don't do that because we don't want to have an MRI in every self-contained unit in our organization. We want it to move nurses back and forth because it's a transportable skill like management. Duplication of resources obviously is a problem, etc. You can look at the strengths and weaknesses. Let's skip down to matrix. Matrix structure is where you have both of those, okay? You have one set of vice presidents that deal with the functional side, and you have another set of vice presidents that deal with the self-contained unit side. And in every department within that structure, that department manager has two bosses, a VP of nursing and a VP of heart health. If that was the case and that was a self-contained department and that department manager reported to both the functional boss and the customer boss, the self-contained unit boss, that would be a matrix structure. Now, the problem with that is you have to have huge organizations to do that, not small ones like healthcare providers. They are very hard to manage because of the dual bosses and the demands from dual environments, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of conflict in those organizations. Where you see those organizations are like defense contractors, Boeing or whomever. And that's because the manufacturing, the function is critical and the customer is critical. Does that make sense? You are making cutting edge weapons. You are the only one in the world capable of doing it. Function's critical. However, you got one general in the Pentagon or one general in England or France or Norway or wherever. You got maybe 5 people that are absolutely critical to buying your product. If they don't like it, they don't buy it. And so you've got to really pay attention to the customer. You've got to really pay attention to operations. When you have that, a matrix structure makes sense. If you don't, it doesn't make sense. And what happens if one of those, the customer or the operations, loses power, that organization will collapse towards the power. If the customer becomes more important than operations, it'll collapse over into a service line structure or vice versa. It's a little crazy, and in healthcare, don't even think about matrix organizations. They're way too complex. We don't have organizations that are big enough to do it. The conflict would just overwhelm us. So what do? We create hybrid organizations. We start out with a functionally structured hospital that grows big and powerful, that buys another hospital, or it buys a lot of clinics, or it builds clinics, or it builds physician practices and buys them. What you've got there is a functional structured hospital mothership and a self-contained unit organization based on geography. Does that make sense? If you've got Children's Hospital sitting in the med center as the mothership, and then all of a sudden you've got the Women's Pavilion next to it doing a totally different thing, then you start building all these clinics and physician practices out in the community, and they've been doing it for years, long before the other organizations started doing it. Most of the organizations like St. Luke's and Methodist went out and built hospitals in the suburban area to feed the mothership. What happened in Memorial is they went into the med center and bought a hospital to feed but that's not the mothership. Herman isn't, well, it's starting to be. But all of these organizations had different strategies, but they're all hybrid strategies. Does that make sense? You got a functionally structured mothership with other things coming out of it more on a service line, self-contained unit. Really, service line is inappropriate. Self-contained unit based on geography. In some cases, based on service line. Women's Pavilion is service line. That's another example. Well, to the extent that they've bought urgent care, well, that's not even a good example. Never mind, just forget it. Basically, they're complex matrix structures that mix functional and self-contained, but they don't mix it purely in a matrix. They mix it in odd ways. Now, every hospital or every healthcare service provider is a hybrid structure in the simple fact that the physician are in a separate dotted line relationship to the organization. Does that make sense? Unless I buy my physicians, I am in a dotted line relationship and they have a separate organization. So that causes a hybrid structure right off the bat. So those are the options for structure. Now, just like in environment, the biggest issue was uncertainty. The biggest issue in an organization is complexity. The more you go up the chain from functional to service line, self-contained, or to matrix or hybrid, what you're doing is you're making your organization more complex. Does that follow? And so complexity is the issue that you're dealing with. You want to make your organization as less complex as possible. Now, wouldn't it be nice to just dump the functional structure and go straight to a self-contained unit structure so those self-contained units could pay attention to their customer base? That'd be great, but you can't do it because you can't afford an MRI for everyone. You can't afford a lab for everyone. You can't afford a separate set of nurses for everyone. That's the problem. So what you do is you end up with this much more complex organization, which means you have much more work as a manager, as an executive, to make that organization run. That's the problem. So you have to understand your organization's environment. You have to understand its hierarchy and its chain of command, because the more complex, the more screwed up the chain of command gets. You have to understand the people in that chain of command. You've got to make strategy real. And the more complex your organization, the more real your strategy has to be. I'm not going to talk in this tape about strategy because you guys will all have to take a course on strategy, planning and strategic planning. And so you're going to get a lot of strategic planning. You'll get some in this course, but the bottom line is strategy is really a control function for the environment and for the complexity of your structure. And so you've got to design a very clear strategy and make sure everybody has that strategy in their face all the time. And the more complex, the more uncertain, the more that has to happen. You have to know the control points in an organization. You have to know the people that have the knowledge and the connections that facilitate. There are go-to people in any organization. The more complex it gets, the more you as a manager have to know who those go-to people are. You also have to build relationships with people, those people particularly, but all people, both vertically and horizontally in your organization. You've got to build relationships with those folks. Because as it gets more complex, you can't pay attention to the whole thing. You're going to have to go out to people and trust them. Does that make sense? And so building those relationships becomes pretty important. You also, and particularly in healthcare, are going to have to build interactions. You're going to have to partner with folks. You, by definition, right off the bat, you're going to partner with physicians. You might be partnering with other subcontractors. You might have subcontracted, you've probably subcontracted cleaning rooms. You've probably subcontracted all of the collecting of garbage and biomedical waste and all that stuff. You might subcontract your biomed engineering. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you know, if you're relying on clinics and physician practices and other suburban hospitals to send you business to the mothership, you better have good relationships with all of those folks. And so understanding the motivations and the goals of all those people and partnering with them becomes really critical as a supervisor. You've got to understand your organization's culture, and I'm going to come back to that. The next slide is it just shows all of the things that are interacting, which I told you earlier, people and strategy and culture and so forth and so forth. Those are all the elements that need to fit together. One of the things that you do when a structure gets very complex is that you have linking mechanisms in the organization. You link between the differentiated parts of your organization. The more complexity, the more, I've already said, the more uncertainty your environment, the more boundary spanning people you will have. Well, the more complex the organizational structure, the more linking roles you will have. And so that you see as you build into a complex environment and you get a complex structure for whatever reason, I've already named them for healthcare, you've got a lot more roles that people have to take on. And so the roles for complex structure are linking roles. You have a lot of liaison roles. You have people that coordinate things. You have analysts who analyze other people's work. You have more management. You have people who integrate across committees or projects, project managers. So you can see that all of a sudden you're getting a lot more people. You're also getting a lot more dotted lines in an organizational structure. It's really simple that C reports to B and B reports to A, done. But when you get all of these integrator, liaison, linking roles, they all have dotted line relationships with people. And so remember, whether there's a straight line where the budget flows or there's a dotted line with no budget flowing, who are you going to pay attention to? The solid line. And so you got all these roles out there doing all this integration and linking and coordinating and blah, 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 project management, but you got a mess because those people are basically running on their smarts rather than power that's based on budget. So life gets crazy. Bottom line is your job as a manager gets more complex. Now, I haven't even got started yet. We've talked about environment, we've talked about structure. Let's talk about technology next. When you guys hear the word technology, you probably hear IT, computers and the internet and email, and that's not what I mean. When I say technology, I mean the combination of all the skills and all the knowledge and all the tools and all the equipment and all the computers and all the machines and all the paper and all the systems and procedures, everything that goes in to getting the work done. To me, a computer is a tool. The internet is a tool. Neither of those are going to get me to think better. They're not going to get me to analyze better. They're not going to let me conceptualize problems better. They are not going to do any of that. They just help me speed everything up. Does that make sense? It is a tool for speed. The email allows me to talk to 10 people at one time, where I used to have to go either telephone them or sit in their office and talk to them. Does that make sense? But with email and texting, I might have 30 conversations going on. I might have 100. And I'm bouncing balls and handling those 100 conversations. When back in the old days, I had one phone call or one office visit, that was it. At the most, I could have somebody sitting in my office and I'd be talking on the telephone. You don't even remember those days because you're too young. But all it does is speed up your world and make it more complex. The internet allows me to collect information faster. Could I collect all that information in the old days? The answer is yes, I could. Now, you have to understand that 90% of the information on the internet is garbage. But the bottom line is, I could still collect all the information. I could go to libraries, I could call people up, I could write them letters. It would have taken me months to gather the information, and it might take you a minute. So all it is a speed. Does it make you think better? No, it actually makes you think worse, poorer. Why? Because you got too much information. I mean, if you have 2 pieces of information and you choose between A and B, that's simple. If you've got 100 pieces of information, your decision-making process just became much more complex. So it actually screws you up to a very large extent. But almost all of the things that we call technology today, email, texting, computers, all that does is make us faster and able to deal with more things at one time. Does it make you make better decisions? No. Does it make you conceptualize a problem more completely or more thoroughly? No. That's still going on in your brain. Does that make sense? Don't ever lose sight of that. I'm old, right? And I remember when people were saying, oh, television, so cool. Television's going to revolutionize education. Did it? No, it gave a little bit more information, speeded things up. And then videotape came out. Oh, videotape's going to revolutionize education. We can video behaviors and show it to people. Rather than you standing around and waiting for your boss to do something, we can videotape and show it to 10 people. Did that revolutionize education? No. And then computers came out. Oh my God, we're going to revolutionize education. Did that revolutionize education? Has Blackboard made you smarter? No.
More frustrated.
Say that again?
Just more frustrated.
We're on tape. We got to be quiet. I didn't hear it anyway. The bottom line is that all this technology, for the most part, has simply speeded things up and made it more complex. Okay, and it hasn't changed how you get taught. You get taught by me showing you something, you practicing it, getting feedback, and putting it in long-term memory. Same thing happens. It doesn't happen any faster. I might be able to present 5 things at you at the same time, but remember, you can only remember 5 to 7 things at any given time anyway. Your short-term memory is finite. And so education hasn't changed at all, except that I've got more information to show you, I can do it faster, blah, 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 blah. So don't be too enamored with technology. It's basically a tool to do more things with less time, bottom line. However, you still need to pay attention to how technology gets used in an organization. And again, there's a very finite number of ways that technology is applied in an organization. Obviously, more complex technology makes it harder for managers to regulate an organization. Highly skilled workers usually require a more complex, flexible structure. Unskilled workers are usually in a linear structure, usually a lot less information going around, a lot less interaction, usually downward one-way communication. basically technology is going to also drive your people. You have a complex technology, you're probably going to have a lot different communication and a lot different kind of structure in your organization. Skilled workers usually are very professionalized, they need continuing education, they want two-way communication, the organization needs to be more flexible. All of this is going on. So you can see that we've got environment, we got structure here, and we often structure to meet the uncertainty of our environment. But all of a sudden we got technology sitting down here, and if the technology is complex, it's going to require complex people. And that may make the organization more complex. So if the environment gets uncertain, and I can solve some of that with technology because it allows me to deal with more stuff faster, then I'm going to have a more complex structure, and I'm going to end up with more complex people. Are you with me so far on that? And so that's how all this starts to hang together. Anyway, the way an organization's structure revolves around technology is really how complex the work is, and how you group tasks together into jobs, and how you group jobs into functions, how you allocate authority and divisions and management over all of that. One of the things that computers have done is that they have been able to manage people in simple jobs and allowed me to get rid of managers, supervisors. Does that make sense? I can now count the number of keystrokes. I can count the number of people that a customer service rep talks to. I can look at the satisfaction of those people in talking to the customer service rep. So the computer can measure and collect data like crazy, which means that I needed probably fewer supervisors to be over those people. So again, it speeds it up, gives me more information, but one of the things that's happened by that is I need less management. So in some cases with simple jobs. Now, when I get to complex jobs, it probably hasn't done that. Okay? Robotics, for instance, you would think, oh, I'm going to get rid of a lot of people with robotics. What happens? You usually hire about 3 to 4% more, because the machinery is so complex that it takes more people to maintain it and program it and on and on. And those people tend to be higher salaried than some of the people that got replaced. But do things move 100 times faster? Yes, they do. Speed again. Technology usually increases speed and complexity. Now, if you go to the next couple slides, the next slide where it says an example of different technology structure fit, that's just one example of mass production versus computer assisted, computer implemented, or computer run management. The bottom line is that mass production usually is linear. It usually takes unskilled labor, et cetera, usually one-way communication, less of it, less flexibility. Where you've got computer-controlled operations, they're different. You have more complex people, you've got a more complex structure, you've got control by computers, on and on and on. And if you look at this, it talks about span of control and hierarchical levels and tasks and decision making and etc. Mass production, the span of control is very wide. You can have a lot of people working under one manager if they're working on an assembly line, because who controls them? The assembly line does. The class didn't know that. But if you take an assembly line and it's running along, everybody's controlled by that assembly line. I don't need a lot of managers standing around watching people do that. I could actually have computers count whether something went into a car, for instance. Now, when you get into computer-based operations, my span of control is going to be much narrow because we probably have to have a lot more communication, and there's probably going to have to be more problems dealt with, et cetera, et cetera. Once you have an assembly line running, it runs fine. It just keeps going and going and going. More complex operations need a lot more back and forth problem solving. So you can look at this list, but the bottom line here is that technology and structure fit together. If my technology changes and becomes more complex, my structure is going to become more complex. If I move from a non-skilled type of job, like an assembly line, to a highly complex manufacturing, like building a Dreamliner for Boeing, I'm going to have a lot more talking and two-way communication and problem-solving meetings and on and on and on over here. Over here, I'm not. It's the assembly line's going to run, and it's going to keep running, and people are going to work on it. They may get sick, but I'll put another body in there, and that's it. It's a fairly simple management problem, a very complex management problem over here. And so what you're going to get, what I'm really talking about is technology creates much more complex organizational structure and much more need for management in most cases. Now, I did put a slide in here just on interdependence. There's a couple slides about different kinds of structure. Different kinds of technology. The first is pooled versus sequential versus reciprocal interdependence. Bottom line is, in any technology, in any operations that you find, any place, you only got three possibilities. You got pooled, sequential, or reciprocal. Pooled is, and it's really the lowest form of interdependence, is basically the work doesn't flow between units. It's not on an assembly line. It goes from worker A, B to C to D to E. Basically, the worker comes to the item. If you have a ship in a shipyard, the work flows down into the item, to the ship. If you put a patient in a bed in a hospital, the nurse comes and does her thing. The technician comes and does his or her thing, and so forth and so forth. That's pooled interdependence. Sequential interdependence is where things are in a line. An assembly line is sequential. The car moves along, and this guy puts a part in, and this person puts a part in, and this person puts a part in, and so forth. Reciprocal interdependence is the most complex, and that's where the output of one unit serves as the input for the next unit. And it keeps going on and on and on like that. Most of the things that you will see in healthcare are pooled interdependence. You basically have a patient sitting there, and then even in a doctor's office, the patient comes in, the receptionist sees them and gets a copay and fills out the paperwork, and then the nurse assistant sees them and takes the vitals, and then the nurse may or may not see them, or the physician sees them, and then the practice nurse sees them. I mean, there's always an order to what happens to the patient, but the patient sits in an exam room and those people pop in. Does that make sense? And so that's pretty much how healthcare runs. You see, healthcare runs on the simplest form of interdependence. Most assembly lines are sequential. Car runs down, or washing machine runs down, and people do their thing to it as it flows by. And so healthcare, again, is on the simple side of affairs. We would be much more efficient if we moved to sequential or reciprocal interdependence from pooled interdependence. We're inefficient, and we irritate the customer because we make the customer sit there in a pooled interdependence. I'm on a tirade now, but the bottom line is that interdependence is like the critical element of all technology. What's really important to understand, and And there are several other theories of technology. Woodward's got one, Perot's got one, Thomson, really, famous researchers. But they all boil down to 3 or 4 levels of technology. Woodward was small batch, large batch, and I can't remember what she called the third one, but it was really flow, like the flow of oil through a refinery. And so you were either building parts in a small batch, like you're a job shop and somebody sends you a set of plans to weld something together into this structure. That's a small batch operation. A large batch operation is assembly line making cars, and a flow through, and that's not the right term, but the flow through is where you've got oil flowing through a refinery, and you have a very small number of people who stand around and turn valves and look at dials. Those are the 3 levels of technology under Woodward's strategy or theory that you could have. And do you see that interdependence is intermingled into that? Those 3 have different kinds of interdependence. The small batch job shop has a very complex interdependence because every job is different and people are talking about how to get it done and designing it and coming up with processes and which welder should work on what and which parts should be stored where. Do you see on large batch all that's worked out, and once it's worked out, boom, it just runs. But in a small batch, it gets worked out for every job and it gets much more complex. And you start to get some kind of reciprocal interdependence going. Anyway, the issue is that my technology, for the most part, is going to determine my people. I'll say it again. My technology is going to determine my people. Why do physicians not like bedside computing or any kind of computing?
They're not familiar with it.
They're not familiar with it. They don't know how to type. They want to know everything before they walk into the room and interact with the patient. There's all kinds of reasons. But the issue is until that technology matches the mentality of the people, the technology will not be used at its most efficient rate. Does that follow? And so I'm going to have to get rid of all the physicians that can't type. I'm going to have to get rid of all the physicians that are afraid of computers. I'm going to have to get rid of all the physicians that like the old electronic medical system and are willing to move to a new one. In other words, I have to get rid of all the physicians that resist change of any kind. And I have to get rid of all the physicians that are used to knowing everything from the nurse before they walk in and talk to the patient. How many physicians do I have left? Not very many. The one's coming out of med school today, and that's about it. And so the point is that when I change the technology, I change the people. It's usually not vice versa. And so technology is going to drive people. Now, if technology drives people to be more highly professionalized, I'll probably end up changing structure. Does that make sense to you? If I have a much more professionalized workforce, they're going to require more two-way communication, they're going to require more teams, they're going to require more engagement, they're going to want to express their fears rather than take orders. They won't want controlling bosses. Does that all make sense? All of a sudden, I'm changing the structure of my organization. I'm changing the authority structure and probably the departmentalization of my organization. So technology changes people, people changes structure. And it goes around and around and around and across ways in that circle, 100 different ways. Guess whose job it is to figure all this out and predict it? Yours. It is a very complex world. All I want to do in this lecture is to get you to think that, gee, there's an interconnection between technology and people and structure and strategy and environment and so forth and so forth. If your environment becomes uncertain, you're going to have a more complex structure. If you have a more complex structure, you're probably going to have a more professionalized workforce, because those boundary role people are out there working by themselves, predicting the environment. They're going to be more professionalized. Whole different kind of management, different structure. So your job is to draw a map of this. Okay, here's where I am now, this is where I want to go. Or this is where I am now, and this is the strategy we want to follow. What am I going to have to do with technology and people and culture and so forth to support that? Because if you don't do it, it will kill you. If you do not have all of that figured out, it will come back and it will bite you. And the one that bites you the most is the one we haven't talked about yet, culture. Culture will bite you every time, because you will try to change the people, you will try to change the culture, and you'll try to change the structure or the technology, and the culture is the glue that keeps an organization bound together. And all your resistance is going to come out of culture. And the bottom line is, if you don't pay attention to all of it, something's going to bite you, but culture particularly. I'm not going to talk a lot about people. I already said I wasn't going to talk a lot about strategy, because you've got whole courses in that. You got a strategy course, you got an HR course, you've got to take a management course to get through this program. You have to understand people's motivation. You have to understand how to deal with competence or lack of competence. You have to understand rewards and punishments. You have to understand career paths, how people move through a career, and what people want to have a long career. Not long is the wrong word. A steadily moving upwards career versus the ones that want a flat career. You have to understand trust and open communication with people. Some people require significantly more engagement. Some people want to be told what to do. You've got to figure that out. You have to empower people. You have to look for talent. You have to move people up as they want to move up. On and on and on and on. Those are all HR management questions, but people are going to be different in an organization based on its structure and its technology and its culture, etc. We've talked about control and self-handicapping in here. If you have a fairly controlling organization and you say, I'm going to kill this culture of control, I'm going to start bringing in fairly independent, not controlling people, if you bring them in and stick them one person at a time into the department, what's going to happen? The controlling people are going to drive them right back out the door, and you won't make any headway whatsoever. And so you have to understand those kind of interconnections between this. If you want to bring in really independent, self-actualized, whatever type of people who don't live in a controlling environment, you need to bring them in and put them in their own unit, and so that they become powerful, and then create a second unit and a third unit and a fourth unit. And as they start to interact and become more powerful in the organization, they'll drive all the controlling people out. It's that tipping point deal again. You have to create tipping points in organizations. If you feed people in one at a time, they'll be eaten alive. That's just an example. But I'm not here to teach you everything about people and everything about strategy and everything about technology. I'm here with one message, and that message is all these things interact. If you change one, you change something else. I don't care what it is. If you change the people, you're going to change the culture, and you're going to change something else. If you change the technology, you'll change the people, and you probably have to change the structure to match that. They all interact, and it's very complex, and if you don't pay attention to it, you will fail. I mean, simple fact, you will fail. You will be trying to make a change, and you'll poke on one thing, and the rest of it won't come along, and it will overpower you. What is the most important element of organizational life? I'm not asking it right. What is the most powerful force in an organization. It is inertia. It is staying at a steady state. Remember, when you're trying to change an organization, you're working against the most powerful force in any organization. Survival comes from steady state. Stay like you are, don't get too crazy, survive, and that's what's going on in every organization. So if you think I'm going to magically bring in this technology and have it significantly increase productivity, if you haven't talked to the physicians and got them to accept it, it isn't going to happen. The physicians will kill you by refusing to use the system or screwing it up or sabotaging it or doing something. All of this stuff interacts. Okay, let's talk about, which I think is the last one, culture. Actually, the last one is strategy. But I said I wasn't going to talk about strategy much. Let's talk about culture just a little bit. Culture is the shared values and beliefs and assumptions that really define the appropriate way to act or think or believe in an organization. It's everything. It's values, beliefs, stories, assumptions, artifacts. It's everything that defines the appropriate way to behave. Now, what's important about culture, it is the glue that holds an organization together and makes it not move. It makes it a steady state. It's the glue that holds it all together. And so if you want to move an organization or you want to tear a piece of it out, you got to deal with culture. I mean, there's just no way around it. Culture is the glue that holds it together and keeps it a steady state. And it is an incredibly powerful force. And when we talk about organizational change taking years and you know, not waiting for one change to finish before we start another change, all of those discussions are really based on the fact that culture is what holds everything together. Culture is shared. It helps people solve problems. It helps people know how to act. It's taught to newcomers almost immediately when they come into an organization. It influences behavior. It influences decision making. It goes on and on and on. It is a pervasive force that tells everybody how to behave, that keeps the organization steady. And your job as a manager, if you want to affect change, is to make that organization not steady, to move. And everything you do about changing technology, changing people, changing structure, any of those things, you're going to have to deal with culture, which is what glues it all together. You got to unglue it. That's an old theory of organizational change, is that you have to unfreeze or unglue an organization, change it, and then refreeze it. Sounds simple, but it's critically complex, particularly in large organizations and particularly in hybrid structured organizations that don't quite know what they're doing. Anyway, levels of culture, that's another slide. Artifacts, things that you hear, see, and feel, beliefs, values, assumptions. In trying to assess culture is very difficult. There are instruments that try to assess culture. There are checkoff forms to assess culture. It's very difficult. And one of the things that's going to happen around culture is that you're going to have an organizational culture, but then you're going to have subcultures across division. So you're going to have all kinds of subcultures. One of the things I have not talked about, and it's really not pertinent to this lecture, is goals. But where you get goal incongruence, where one division has a different set of goals than the organization, then you've got automatic problems. Oil and gas deals with that all the time because the organization's goal is to make money and increase the wealth of their stockholders and blah, 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 blah. But you get down to the department, their goals are pretty simple. They get down to meet budget and meet time schedules, and sometimes those conflict. It's the same thing with culture. You might get a subculture that conflicts with the organizational culture, or two subcultures will conflict. It's one of the things that you will have to deal with in any kind of change, whether it's incremental or fast. Fast change is re-engineering, any kind of big initiative. Incremental change is quality improvement, one step at a time. Even quality improvement, even as slow and draggy as quality improvement is as far as change goes, really gets down to different cultures and different sets of beliefs in your subgroups. People make decisions in different ways. They may have different goals. And so when you put a team together to deal with a quality improvement project, you've got to make sure that everybody's talking the same language, which they're probably not. If they're not talking the same language, they'll never agree on an improvement. There's crazy way, like if you get a job as an executive in some organization, I highly encourage you to put the crappiest clothes on you own and go down on a Monday morning and wander around the hospital and see what happens. The opposite of that is put the best suit on you have and walk around. You'll get strange behavior with that too. Sometimes if you suspect a very controlling, arbitrary, inconsistent past management in an organization, the best thing to do is put your best suit on and go wander around, because people will not give you eye contact and they'll hide and they'll wonder what the hell you're doing there. A lot of really dysfunctional things will happen. But you can tell a culture of an organization by just wandering around, talking to people. Are they helpful? Are they afraid of you? Do they want to throw you out? Are you an inconvenience to deal with or a problem to help solve? All of that tells you about culture. And you just start taking notes and figuring it out. It's not that easy, but if you don't get a good feel for culture, then look up some of the instruments for measuring. None of them are good, particularly. One of the things we want to do in this course is create a good assessment of culture. I don't know if we'll get it done, but anyway, culture is one of those things that makes sense of an organization for people, tells them how to act. Remember, most people join organizations because they want to be part of something bigger. They want to contribute to something, and that's particularly true in healthcare. So many healthcare people say, I want to help people, that's why I'm here. And what they're doing is hurting you and screwing you up. But I want to help people. The culture, it helps people see what the appropriate way of behaving in this organization is. Now, if that culture is saying that you should not ask for feedback, you shouldn't collect information from customers because it's an inconvenience to change, that's one culture. If the culture is always ask for feedback, always ask the patient how they're doing and really listen, etc., because we want to change how we're doing things, that's a different culture. How many times do you see those cultures? I would suggest to you that in most healthcare organizations, you don't really see a clear culture of, I want to know how you're doing because I want to change and make it better. Most care providers, the patient's kind of an inconvenience. They're just something, a body that you work on. Anyway, it doesn't matter what it is. It matters that there is a culture and there are subcultures, and it is your job to figure it out. Because if you want to change the technology and your culture is going to stop it, you're going to have to change the culture to get the technology installed and working. And that is particularly true with physicians. If physicians want to resist something, it's going to be very hard to make that something work because they're a powerful force in an organization. If nurses want to resist something, That's another very powerful. There's three powerful forces in every healthcare organization: administration, nurses, and physicians. And if you get two of those aligned against you for a change, forget it. It's not going to happen. And so culture is just, you've got to take a peek at culture and say, are the stories and is everything about culture against me with this change? If so, you're going to have to go in and start working on culture before you make the change. Now, usually you work at those things at the same time. It's pretty easy to change culture. Just fire virtually everybody in your organization and bring in the new people that you want with a new culture. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But you usually can't do it. Now, there's lots of liabilities to culture, and I probably told you what they are, but it's a barrier to change, it's a barrier to diversity. It can be a huge barrier to mergers and acquisitions. How many years ago did Memorial buy Herman? Over 10, probably. And guess what? They're still today dealing with culture problems in that merger/acquisition. One of the culture problems would be that if you ask somebody from Memorial what happened, they'd say, we had an acquisition. If you ask somebody from Herman what happened, they'd say, well, we had a merger. But I can tell you that we had an acquisition because Herman was going under. But that's a cultural thing. That people are sitting here deluding themselves that we were a powerful institution and we merged with that other one. You didn't merge. You would have been dead and closed up if you hadn't been acquired. So if you went and talked to people in St. Luke's, maybe I shouldn't be naming names so much here. But you know, St. Luke's has had trouble for years, and I'm sure they think they're merging, but no, not at all. So bottom line is that culture comes from people, but it also comes from technology and structure and a lot of things. But it because I deal with culture a lot, I think it's a really powerful force. But you know, it's the force that stops most change. But you've got to always look at culture when you're making change. If you're going to change the structure, if you're going to change the technology, you got to look at culture. But culture does come from people. I mean, you can change culture by changing the executive force. You can change culture by driving the folks out of your organization. If I had a really controlling organization, we've talked about control, if I had a really controlling organization, I'd go find the people that are the most dysfunctional and drive them out of my organization and try to replace them with much less controlling, more inclusive management. And I would significantly change the culture of that organization. Does that make sense? The trouble is I don't have any good instrument to figure out who all those really dysfunctional, controlling people are. They could look pretty good. But if I magically could do that, change the culture overnight. Most cultures in organizations change fairly quickly if you change the CEO, because the new CEO will bring in the C-suite, all new, people that believe in his or her vision, and those people will hire department managers over the next couple of years that see the vision, and within 2 to 3 years you'll find a fairly huge jump in how that organization functions and what the culture of it is, because they change top down, which is the easy way to change a culture. Much harder to change it the other way. If you're trying to change something from the bottom up and the CEO doesn't believe it, you're probably never going to change it. So what does all this mean? It means that all of these things, structure, strategy, culture, environment, are all in a reciprocal arrangement. Environment is very much going to drive the structure and the technology of an organization. Structure and technology are very much going to drive the people and the culture of an organization, and so forth and so forth and so forth. They are all in a fairly equal reciprocal arrangement. I'm not gonna give you all the information about culture or all the information about how technology functions. You can go to any management text. In fact, you can get an entire text about technology, or you can go to a management text and read one chapter on technology. You can read about this stuff, and you're going to hear about it in classes. What I really want to get through to you as a leader is that you're not going to significantly change an organization unless you understand the reciprocal nature of those elements. One drives the other. If you change the culture, you're going to probably change the people and everything else about it. If I go in as a CEO and I bring my direct reports that believe my vision, and they get department managers that believe the vision, the people are going to leave in droves. I'm going to drive up turnover, and I'm going to get rid of all the people that don't see the vision. I will significantly change the people and therefore the culture of the organization. Now, can I keep the people and change the culture? Yes, I can. Significantly more difficult, significantly more time to do it. I'm probably going to have to marshal a lot of reward and punishment tools to do it. I'm going to have to do a lot of training. But can I do it? Can I go into an organization and make it magically more cost-conscious or more patient-focused or more database focused? I absolutely can. That's changing culture. Will it change some of the people? Yes. Is it going to be much more costly than just getting rid of all the people and bringing in a new workforce? Yes. Depending on how many. But all of these are decisions that you'll make as a manager and a leader. I just want you to not think that, oh, I can go in and change culture, or I can go in and change the structure of this organization and everything will be hunky-dory. You could screw yourself. You've got to pay attention to the reciprocal nature of all those things. Okay, turn me off. Bye.